Good morning from New Mexico. It is with great pleasure that I get to introduce José Antonio Esquibel, who is a genealogical researcher, historian, author of many articles and books related to New Mexico's Spanish colonial era history. He is co-author of Juan Dominguez de Mendoza, Soldier and Frontiersman of the Spanish Southwest, 1627 to 1693, published in 2012, along with Mark Simmons, France Scholes, and Eleanor Adams. In 2009, King Carlos II of Spain, King of Spain, admitted José Antonio to the knightly Orden de Isabel la Católica for his dedication to uncovering and preserving the history of Spain and Spanish heritage in New Mexico. He is a past presenter of many articles, lectures for New Mexico Genealogical Society, and I would like to turn this over to El Caballero, Don José Antonio Esquibel.
Well, hey, thank you so much, Henrietta. It's a real pleasure to be here. And good morning, everyone. So glad that you could be here today to be part of this conference. Really, big thank you and appreciation to the crew here at the New Mexico Genealogical Society for putting on such a high-class, high-quality, very professional conference. And certainly hoping that you're going to get quite a bit out of this experience. I'm hoping today to be able to provide you with about a half hour of history, and then we're going to go into a half hour with the family. So bear with me. And please know that although we're going to go through some of this rather quickly, you will have the opportunity to come back and rewatch the video again to take notes a little bit more closely if you'd like. So in the meantime, don't worry so much about jotting a lot of notes down. Just appreciate the history and the genealogy and come back and take a look at this. I really was excited to put this particular presentation together because in preparation and putting these slides together, it helped me put an outline of a chapter of a book I'm working on regarding the history of 17th century New Mexico. It's very curious to me, and I think many of you found this as well as you've done your research. When we talk about the history of New Mexico, people will jump into 1598 when Oñate came to New Mexico as a milestone date. And then very little is said after that. And next thing you know, it's 1680. And the Spaniards are being evicted or chased out of New Mexico in the aftermath of the Pueblo Indian uprising. And then we have 1693 when Vargas came back, and pretty much not a whole lot said in between. So we don't have a lot of information, at least people don't seem to have a lot of information around what happened in between, but there are some historians that have put some good books together. John Kessel is one who's written about the history of 17th century New Mexico. Also, France Scholes, but many of his works aren't in books that are easily accessible, although they're becoming better accessible in snippets of articles that were published in the New Mexico Historical Review, and those are now online, but it's kind of hard. Well, what I want to be able to do today is provide you with a bit of a different sense and a little more detail around this history, because it says something about our genealogy as well. It sets a groundwork, a foundation. And I know that we really strongly always go to 1598, but I'm going to give you a new date, 1609, in which I really want you to think of 1609 as the beginning of the Spanish, the founding of New Mexico as we know it and experienced it, beyond that Oñate period. And that's what I'm going to walk you through today. And hopefully you learn a few things new and see this differently, like I've been seeing it from studying the records. So let's go through this. Let's see if we can get this to advance. Well, that was working earlier. My apologies, folks. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute, and then we're going to get back on the share screen. Not sure why that decided not to advance. Give me a moment, folks. Sort out what's going on with this. That's right. Apologies. One more time. There we go. All right, let's take a look at this. Just a reminder, in terms of this route of how people got here, there's that saying that nobody ever got off the boat in New Mexico. There just was no way to get here directly from Spain into New Mexico. So people had a journey this way. And back in the 1500s, it was not an easy journey. Although some work had been done through the middle of the 1500s to blaze a path to the north through lands inhabited by indigenous people, it took quite a while to get to this point. And even by the 1590s, the road pretty much had only gone as far up as this red dot here that says Santa Barbara. But just as a reminder that really the Oñate era begins around 1695 when Oñate signed a contract and he begins recruiting people in Mexico City in April 1596. And right away between April and July, these individuals that are recruited, mainly single men, already begin to move northward. The Viceroy didn't want all these single men hanging out in Mexico City with nothing to do while they waited for the expedition. So began to move people northward into Zacatecas, into Sombrerete, and then northward into Durango. And then finally above Durango, halfway between Durango and Santa Barbara, we have the Minas de Casco. And this is where many of the individuals who were being recruited came to hang out together before the expedition went northward. And I'll explain some of the delays, because if you look at this time frame, you're looking at almost 2 years before this expedition even began to move north into New Mexico. By December 1597, 1598 of February, they have gone up a little bit northward to that red dot in the middle there. The Valle de San Bartolomé is in the Valle de Santa Barbara, and they hang out here for about a year before they finally get the permission to move forward. And we'll talk about what those delays were about. And then by April 1598, they're up there at that next red dot, the El Paso del Rio del Norte. And then by August 1598, they make their way up north to San Juan de los Caballeros. So that's that route to keep in mind. Let's take a look at these numbers here. So in September 1596, there were already 200 men missing who had been recruited in Mexico City. So you can see that although people were excited about coming northward, potentially, some of these delays began to discourage people and they walked away. So already Oñate was going to have trouble recruiting people. There is a muster roll of February 1597, and you can see the numbers here because the expedition was divided up into different locations. And you can see that roughly here, there were about almost a little over 200 soldiers from the Minas de Casco, La Puana, Valle de San Bartolomé, and Oñate said that there were about 50 or 60 other men still on the way. And he was required to bring at least 200 soldiers. So he had the 200 plus more, maybe 250. But the delays meant that some people walked away and didn't continue. And another muster roll in December 1597, February 1598, again in the Valle de San Bartolomé and San Jerónimo, gives us a count of about 128. Now, this is a problem for Oñate because he was required to recruit 200 men. So already he was struggling to keep people on the expedition, and many people walked away. And then there were some reinforcements that came a little bit later because he had to make up that number. And actually in 1600, there were about 81 men came, of which about 8 of them had families. So that 81 made up that difference of that 128 to get to 200. But it's estimated that about 500 individuals arrived. So it wasn't just the soldiers. About 22 of those soldiers had families. And then they had their servants or helpers or even their own private soldiers, those who could afford their own private little army, coming to about 500 individuals. Now, one of the challenging things, we have no list telling us who actually arrived in New Mexico. We have the list of people who said they were on the way, but there's nothing to tell us who actually made it. So we really have to sift through primary documents to understand who actually came and arrived in New Mexico. So let's talk about this Oñate era. Really, it spans this period of 1595 to 1609. That's the Oñate era. In September of 1595, he makes this offer to the crown that he wants to go to New Mexico to discover, pacify, and convert folks in those provinces. And that's the beginning of that era. Then the end starts to happen in 1607. And this quote here, therefore, in order that my limited means should not be a hindrance to the work of baptism and the extension of the royal crown, I decided for the unburdening of my conscience to resign my office. So already by 1607, Oñate had pretty much given up. He spent a lot of money. I'll tell you a little more about that in a moment. And by April 1609, he's ordered to leave New Mexico. His resignation is accepted and he's gone. And so that ends that period. But that then oftentimes is the period that people think is the beginning of New Mexico Spanish cultural history. Well, there are remnants of this that survive, but really we haven't yet recognized the individuals who stayed past 1609, the people who really founded Spanish New Mexico, who really were people who decided to stick it out and to remain and to found families and to find ways to cooperate with the Pueblo Indians. It's a new start that occurs in 1609, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So this new beginning really comes out of the ashes of the Oñate enterprise. Basically, his enterprise just fizzled. It was a private enterprise. It was not supported by the crown other than giving him permission, and he was required to support these folks with his finances. It was a private enterprise. And at some point, we should look at what he hoped to gain from this private enterprise in terms of riches. And New Mexico would have had a very different history if he had found gold and silver, very different history. But in this new beginning, we owe a lot of credit to several friars who were really strong advocates to keep New Mexico and not to abandon it. And then there was this very small group of Spanish soldiers and families that were also dedicated and willing to remain in New Mexico on behalf of the crown and on behalf of evangelization of the Pueblo Indians. So this is what we're going to get to today. The 1598 Entrada, here's the differences between these two beginnings. That Entrada was an intrusion. The Pueblo Indians did not invite the Spaniards to the north. They were coming looking for discoveries of some sort and ended up being a burden on the Pueblo Indians. And then in 1609, there's a different feel to this. In 1609, some relationships had been established with a few of these men who wanted to remain and with some of these Franciscan friars. And really, there's this compact, there's this agreement that seems to be made between the remaining Spanish individuals and the Pueblo Indians who were friendly to these individuals. And this compact was based around evangelization, around coexistence, and around mutual benefit. So we have these very two different starts to our New Mexico cultural history. The first one, a bit of a false start, didn't quite pan out and it fizzled. And then the second one that gets developed around 1609, 1610, really 1608, 09, and 010. So here's what you're going to get today. I'm hoping that you're going to gain an understanding of what led to the reduced number of Spanish citizens that remained in New Mexico after 1608. What do these records tell us about the conditions of that colony during that time period of 1598 to 1609? What were the reasons given why so many individuals who came with Oñate, they chose to leave by 1604? And what were the circumstances that encouraged some of these individuals to stay? Why did they stay? Second objective, gain understanding of which families remained. And for which of these families we now have some historical information beyond what was published in Origins of New Mexico Families. And I want to give you a good sense of what these records tell us about the number of individuals, what were some of the reasons that they decided to stay here and not to abandon, and what were their possible motivations. Can anyone think about this? It's like beyond the fact that now you know you can't find gold or silver up here, why would anyone stay? And who were the individuals who remain, and how is it that we know their names? And then the last objective, I want to give you an understanding of some of that historical beginnings of the political factionalism and the tension that shaped the social conditions of New Mexico between 1609 and 1640. And this has an influence on matrimonial unions that we can actually see in our genealogy. And why would we consider 1609 a new beginning? I want to have a little sense of what that's about and what were the circumstances that created that conflict between the governors and their supporters and the Franciscan leadership and their supporters. And then what influence did that have on the history of 17th century New Mexico? So that's where we're headed today. So just a reminder, who was Don Juan de Oñate? And remember, he was a person of wealth and privilege, son of a multimillionaire father, made a fortune in silver mining, son of a mother from some of the most elite families of Spain, his grandfather, maternal grandfather, being an appointee of the royal crown as an agent or one of the individuals charged with governing New Spain when it was came underneath the crown. He was born in 1552 and he has a twin. Most people don't know that, but he had a twin brother and he inherited this fortune from his father. And then later he married granddaughter of Cortez and a great granddaughter of Montezuma. However, she was deceased by the time he came to New Mexico. So she never did come to New Mexico, although Oñate did come with a son. Now, why go to New Mexico? Why even come here? And that has a bit of a lengthy history of its own, and hopefully you've had a chance to read some of these, even briefly, accounts in Wikipedia or encyclopedia. But beginning as early as the 1520s and 30s, when Núñez Cabeza de Vaca was part of an expedition that crashed in the Gulf of Mexico, and he and a few companions, most famously, walked across what we call Texas today, and eventually made their way back into New Spain, coming back with these stories of having heard from Indians about these fabulous cities of gold in the north. And that began to attract attention from royal officials about what could be existing in the north that we don't know. One of his companions, Núñez Cabeza de Vaca's companion, is an African named Esteban, and he and a Franciscan friar make a journey up north. And they're really some of the first ones to encounter some of the Pueblo Indians in New Mexico and come back with these stories of these Pueblo communities up in the north. And that's what leads next to the Vasquez de Coronado expedition. Spends a couple of years up in the north, but they don't find the gold. They do encounter the Pueblo Indians. There are conflicts between the Spanish and the Indians, and eventually they come to the south without any intent of settling the north. But after that, people continue to want to keep going up north to see what's there, and you see a whole host of these other folks. And it's this last one that was an illegal expedition to the north that Oñate wanted to go to the north to arrest these two. What he didn't know is they'd already been killed in New Mexico. So there was this interest, and this sense that there was something to be discovered up in the north that could be like Mexico City, that there must be something up there. We just have to get out there and find it. So Oñate, he proposes this privately funded enterprise, no funds from the crown. It's all going to be supported by him and his wealth, in which he agreed that he was going to fully equip 200 men, soldiers, a private army, not an army of the Spanish government. It's his own private army. He was going to completely supply all the provisions to support the recruits on the journey and in New Mexico. And these are some of the things that he had agreed he was going to bring with him along the journey. Now you can see why, if he had started out on his journey right away in 1596, we may have had a different history in New Mexico. But a few things got in the way. Now, in his proposal, it's very interesting what he says, because it's interesting what he says and then what he does, or ends up being two different things in the history book. But what he says in his contract is, I'm going to bind myself to carry out the said discovery to the best of my ability by peaceful means, friendliness, and Christian zeal. It says nothing about being a conquistador. The people under my command I shall govern with the greatest Christian generosity, in order that our Lord and his majesty may thus be well served. And he says, upon reaching the first provinces and settlements in New Mexico, I shall proceed to found Spanish colonies. That was his intent, is to actually colonize and create settlements in New Mexico. And he had these grand plans for himself to be granted huge tracts of land, to appoint all these officials in all these different settlements. He had this really grand plan for what he thought he could do to create New Mexico as a kingdom of the Empire of Spain. Now, the terms of the royal crown are pretty clear, and they repeat this over and over and over. And I really want to get this point across to you all, that the crown's policy, again, policy is different than what actually happened on the ground, but the crown's policy was, you are to treat the Indians well, you are to set a good example for the Indians. They would agree to provide support for at least 5 Franciscan priests. So that was the crown's, support there, not Oñate. They were willing to grant Oñate a loan of 6,000 pesos, but it had to be paid back by January 1596. And he was to carry out this expedition and the settlement with Christian principles. That's the crown. And they really emphasized this good treatment of the Indians based on the experiences that have been learned in other expeditions and entradas all the way beginning since 1492. This was the royal imperial policy. And you, Oñate, will endeavor to attract the natives with peace, friendship, and good treatment. Also, that all the people in your company act gently and kindly without committing excesses or setting bad examples. Arrange all details with good sense and judgment to the service of God and the increase of our holy Catholic faith. And it goes on. The individual who undertakes this project must pay more attention to the service of God, our Lord, and mine, and the general welfare of the natives than to his own personal interest. The natives must not be compelled to serve against their will, as they resent very much the position of personal service. Under all circumstances, the soldiers must treat the Indians well. So it's pretty clear that the king's intent and the intent of the viceroys in authorizing the expedition was preaching, teaching, the evangelical law and converting the Indians, and to treat them well. Cannot be repeated over and over again in these contracts. And then the second key thing that the Crown asked for, since greater, have enough provisions to support folks. Since the greater success and better results of the expedition depends on taking the people, provisions, and livestock in good order, thereby avoiding the discomforts and troubles which often result from confusion and poor management. You must arrange it so that the provisions and livestock are not lacking when they are needed, but they are carefully preserved, figuring out first the remoteness of the land and the time that the supplies are desired to last. And so in April 1596, the Viceroy ordered a review of the Oñate expedition in order that the people will not run the risk of privation through lack of supplies. So treat the Indians well and have enough provisions to support the folks you're taking. Two key things that the Crown and the royal officials expected of Oñate. So when you look at the records in this contract that was proposed in September 1595, it was signed in December 1595. Really, the purpose of the expedition, at least on paper, was evangelization of the Indians, securing the loyalty and obedience of the indigenous people to the Spanish crown, and then this economic monopoly and seeking riches, which it's an undertone in the contract. Very few people actually say it, but there is some sense that they do want some return on this investment. And so let's really get a sense of the true motivation that really drew all these people, these soldiers, to this expedition, was written and spoken out loud by this man in 1602. The land beyond New Mexico is very vast. For the greed of these riches, which is silver and gold, we Spaniards came to these parts, which is the main bait that attracts us here. So again, let's not be fooled. There's policy that says do this, but there's also this desire and motivation to find these riches, just like Cortez found with the Mexica in central Mexico today. There was this hope that people would strike it rich. Now, really early on, there were already concerns. Certain royal officials and a few viceroys had concerns about Oñate's ability to carry this out. They were concerned that he had insufficient funds. They were concerned about debts that he owed. They were concerned about his management skills. They had heard complaints about him, and that he was already falling short on his contract agreement. This is what caused the delays between January 1596 and 98, this 2-year delay, because it was an on-again, off-again proposition. Concerns would come up. The viceroys would halt everything. The king would say, slow it down. Tell me if there's someone else that can carry this out. And it would go back and forth like that for 2 years, where Oñate would start, then stop, start, then stop. This was not good for the expedition, not good for his expenses either. So for those of you that have an interest, if you want to study this yourself, there are several main sources. Currently, at least on the website Paras, which I hope many of you are already familiar with, that has digital images of archival records from Spain. You can come back to this slide during the video to get the citation here, but you can find these original records in digital form on the Paras website. I started accessing those when Paras was known as Archivo en Red about 20 years ago. And I began going through these original documents, and they correspond really well to the English translations that were made by George B. Hammond and Agapito Rey that were published in 1953. Now, this 2-volume set, Don Juan de Oñate, Colonizer of New Mexico, is not easy to access. For many years, I could only access it as a reference book in libraries. You couldn't even check it out. It could only be seen as a reference book. I was fortunate enough to acquire the 2 volumes, and it's been really indispensable for me to look at both the Spanish digital versions as well as to look at the English translation. But even the English translations aren't always as clean as I think they should be. But if you are interested right now, the Cibola Project, if you're not familiar with this, you need to be. The Cibola Project out of Berkeley University is now an online repository of many of these records have been transcribed, so that if you can't read the actual text from the records from Paras, you can read the transcription. And these are in PDF format online, and pretty much most of the material that's in the book, Don Juan de Oñate, has been transcribed. What's interesting is that most of those records actually turn out to be copies that were made from records that were in the archives in San Gabriel and then were sent down south. So somewhere else there must be records of this expedition, but even the muster rolls were copied from the archival records in San Gabriel and then sent to Mexico City. But certainly you have an opportunity to do your own searching, your own research, and to look into these documents through these main sources. So let's run through a few more things, and then we're going to get to the families. Here's a sense of the numbers. There were about 248 men. About 22 of them, no, let's make it 20, let's make it about 30 men altogether between that time came with families. We estimate about 500 people altogether. By 1601, there's about 217, but then take a look at this big drop between 1602 and 1608. There's only about 68 men left, about half of families. And then by 1609, there's somewhere between 30 and 50. I'm going to go with the high number 50 soldiers left in New Mexico. Not very many. Already there was this misfortune was portended. The expedition ran out of food before they even reached El Paso in April 1598, and they depended on the Pueblo Indians for food. Some of this was voluntary, but some was taken by force. So already you can see the bad news here. The Crown had said, do not run out of food. It's not a good thing. And already they were out of food before they even reached New Mexico. These conditions of the colony between 1509 and 1601 did not get better. You have to feed and clothe 500 people. And already after several years here, even just a couple of years, they were depending on the Pueblo Indians for food. They were putting a burden on the Indians. Some Indians were sharing voluntarily, but in some cases, food was actually taken from them. And in the 4 years that they were there, they found nothing worthwhile in terms of discoveries. And you can see that some men of conscience who decided to leave, they knew what they were doing was wrong. They knew that the burden they were putting on these Indians was not right. They said we were compelled to do them, the Indians, harm because we did not want our women and children to perish. The army's on the verge of starvation, starving to death or dying at the hands of the more hostile bands of Indians. And then there was this discontent. Some of these people who invested a lot of money into this expedition themselves, they'd sold their estates and came up north, not just the soldiers looking for their fame and fortune, but some that had invested their whole estates were disenchanted with New Mexico. And as early as August 1598, so they're not even in New Mexico more than 2 or 3 months, and already some people want to leave. They want to go. They're not having any sense that they're going to find anything of value. Conditions are poor. 4 soldiers did leave. 2 were executed, for which Oñate was later convicted of improper execution, and 2 escaped. And these 2 men here in 1601, they were actually executed by Oñate because they wanted to leave again, and Oñate executed them as well. And it was a crime for which Oñate was later convicted. And then, of course, what we do hear a lot about with the Oñate period is the Yakima tragedy of 1598, and it was a tragedy. We had 32 soldiers who were approaching Yakima Pueblo, and guess what they were doing? They were seeking provisions. Now, they were intent on trading, but still, because they lacked food, they were going out to the Pueblo communities looking for food. The Indians were reticent to provide these provisions. They provided a little bit of firewood, some tortillas, and a little bit of corn, but the Spaniards, although they traded things, they wanted more. They asked for flour, some grounded maize, and then we know one side of the story. We don't know the Yakima Indian side of the story. But this persistent request for provisions created some resentment. And next thing you know, and who knows what happened at the top there in Yakima, but then 11 soldiers and 2 servants were killed. Not sure, who may have done something to offend the Indians, but the Indians defended themselves and ended up killing the Spaniards. And after these formal testimonies and a council of war discussion, there was war declared. And, the Spaniards acted in a way that they believed was in their self-interest to ensure that people knew that you could not overcome us. They were small in number compared to the tens of thousands of Indians, but no other Pueblo groups came to the defense of the Yakima Indians, and it was a tragedy. So by 1601, 1602, we have this lieutenant governor who's saying it's time for us to go. He says, I don't know how I should explain to Your Excellency the events and changes that have taken place in these provinces in New Mexico. I'm at a loss to know who's responsible for the situation. Those of us who remain here can bear it no longer for the reasons stated therein. Until the full report reaches Your Excellency, by humbly begging you to provide us with the necessary things to support life, if we are to remain in these provinces. If aid does not reach us within 5 months, we will be compelled to abandon this land, as we are determined to do so. We ask your excellency to favor us, since we have served his majesty for 6 years in this expedition, together with our wives, children, and families, and have spent a large amount of our estates. So you can see even the discouragement with some of the top officials in the Oñate group. But there were these loyal individuals. There were these individuals who wanted to remain, who wanted to stay. They wished to stay, and they gave a report about why they thought New Mexico should be retained. Now take a look at these names. These are not everyone, but I put up the ones that are among the folks who actually stayed after 1609. And if you look at this list, I bet you're going to see more than one of your ancestors on this list of people who decided to stay. So this is part of the history here for 1509, but not the full history. But here's what Cristóbal Baca had to say in 1601. He says, under no circumstances should the land be abandoned, because people have been baptized. When I assured them that not all of us would leave, they were pleased. Bartolomé Romero says, the natives told him that peace had reigned since we came, whereas formerly they had many wars. Some leaders told him they would be sad if we were to leave, and they offered to provide us food. And then here's what Hernan Martín Serrano wrote, or his testimony was recorded. When the Indians saw that the land was to be abandoned, they asked why we were leaving, since we were all right here and we were friends, and that we could share that what food there was. He replied that not all of us would leave, at which the Indians rejoiced, wherefore he believes that the land would be benefited and befriended if the Spaniards were to remain. And so it's no surprise that these three individuals ended up staying beyond 1609. And we do have this really rare record from 1604 of folks who were still living in New Mexico. And I have highlighted in yellow names of people who actually remained in New Mexico after 1609. And these others are people who apparently left, did not remain in New Mexico. So you'll see probably several of your ancestors, and this particular record does have their signatures. So it tells us that many of these men, or all of these men, were somewhat literate. Now, by 1607, things are not good. And the town council at San Gabriel has this to write to royal officials. In these 12 years, we have suffered the greatest hardships, losses, risks, and deaths ever injured by subjects of the king, our lord, always motivated by two aims: to serve his majesty and to await the help which we expected momentarily from the Christian king. Our second aim was to try to discover by our own efforts something that would benefit his majesty, which means silver or gold. But as the governor and all of us became impoverished early in the expedition and very limited in means, we've been unable to complete the exploration started because of our scanty supplies and few men. And they recommended that Oñate resign his commission. And they set a date of June 1608 to abandon New Mexico if no royal aid was provided. So they were ready to go. And Oñate himself submits his resignation just a couple days later, finding myself hopeless in every respect because I have used up this expedition, my estate, and the resources of my relatives and friends, amounting to more than 600,000 pesos. Folks, that's the equivalent of $20 million today. That's what he spent in those 12 years. And anxious that the fruits of so many expeditions of more than 11 years of labor should not be lost, especially because I'm eager for the Holy Catholic faith should be spread in these lands, and that our King, our Lord, should increase his dominions by the addition of great and rich provinces. So he still thinks that there's something to be found, which according to our information are at our threshold. I find no other means to attain this than to renounce my office, which resignation I am sending to your excellency. And his resignation was accepted in 1608. So that brings an end to the Oñate era. However, there were these individuals who wanted to continue in New Mexico. One of the biggest champions was Fray Lázaro Jiménez. He was sent to Mexico City to ask for permission, first for people to leave, and to receive support from the royal crown, and that they were planning to leave by, well, he was in Mexico City by July 1608. And he reported on poor conditions and the limited number of conversions. He said there were only 100 people converted. And the viceroy at that point recommended that New Mexico be abandoned. But there was this really remarkable turnaround. I mean, the king first decides to suspend all action in New Mexico. It's too costly, there's little benefit, the land is poor, and the question of abandonment should be left to the judges in New Spain. But then we have this amazing turnaround in December 1608. same priest comes back to Mexico City, and now he says there's 7,000 Indians baptized. Now he says that some medals have been found, and he says that the service of God and the benefit of souls is the only fruit to hope for in New Mexico. And with this information, the crown decides to keep New Mexico. And so we see this new era beginning in 1609, where it becomes a royal government endeavor. So now it's supported by the government. We see evangelization still at the core. But now there's this coexistence and mutual benefit. Now that some of these men from 1598, 1600 have formed friendships with the Indians, you now have this different start of where there's a sense of coexistence among the Spanish citizens and the Pueblo Indians. Not all the Pueblo Indians, but the majority of the communities. And there's this mutual benefit. Partly, some of these Pueblo Indians didn't want to be left alone because they were worried that a couple of the others, like the Taos and Picuris and the Apaches, would attack them if the Spaniards were gone. So there was some mutual benefit here. So it's a whole nother flavor, a whole nother scenario for this new beginning, not one of conquest, but one of coexistence. And so just repeating what I just said here with this slide. But there were these personal bonds that were formed, and I find this one to be very interesting. Back in 1601, this individual testified that he saw a Spanish boy who, as a lad, himself told him, grew up among the Indian boys. He knew the language of the Picuris, he knew Keres better than the Indians themselves, and they were astonished to hear him talk. The commissary kept this boy with him, hoping to gain some results from him, probably in the conversion process or the evangelization. But what this tells us is that there were some blending, cultural blending already going on, especially among the young people who were blending themselves with the Indians. So let's talk about these founders. So I'm going to walk you through a list, and then we're going to have a discussion here, or we're going to take your questions. At this point in 1609, there are somewhere between 40, 50 people had remained. There is no single account or record to tell us who they were. So we have to sift through these primary records to identify these individuals. I've been able to, through documentation, identify 37 of them. And so it shouldn't be a surprise to you that you're going to recognize names. If you've traced your ancestry back to this time period, you'll recognize probably more than one ancestor. So that shouldn't be a surprise. But this will also reinforce for you why it is that many of us are related to each other. Because the beginnings of Spanish New Mexico really starts with this small group of people. Don't go to 1598. Most of those folks left. They ended up in Nueva Vizcaya. They ended up in other communities. So there are descendants of them, but they're in other places. In New Mexico, our founding and our original genealogical pool starts in this time period of 1609. This is where it begins. So let's take a look at those. Now, for those who came in 1598, out of that 248 men, only 19 stayed. Emphasize that, only 19 stayed that we can find in the records. So you'll recognize the Archuleta family here. And folks, we have not been able to go beyond his father's name. We know that he was from the Basque community, Ibar, but more research needs to be done with records in that region to see if we can't find that Archuleta surname. Certainly look forward to any one of you who wants to do that research to see if you can uncover anything about this family and determine if they are in the historical records in any way. But he marries a daughter of the Perez de Bustillo family, and I'm going to get to them a little bit later. There's this man who's named Francisco Cadino in the records, but later in the 1620s or so, there are these two mestiza women with the surname Cadimo. So we think there's a connection, but the records aren't strong enough to tell us, but these two women were living, and so we do think that Francisco may have stayed in New Mexico. We're not quite sure. Juan de la Cruz from Barcelona, he marries Beatriz de los Angeles. She was an India Mexicana. She was a native of Tepeaca. She came in 1600 as a servant to Cristobal Brito. Brito did not stay, but apparently Beatriz then did marry Juan de la Cruz, and their children, and particularly one of the daughters, married into the Griego family. And so folks with Griego ancestry are descendants of this particular couple. There's this Don Juan de Escaramad from Murcia, but we know he was married and he had children, but there's no record that he left descendants in New Mexico. So We continue to do some searching there to see if perhaps there are descendants, but you'll see that the names with asterisks are the ones that left descendants based on documentation. Here we have Juan Griego. Many of you probably have Juan in your genealogy, a son of Lázaro. I know people are trying to find more about him. The thing is, it's really challenging because we're not sure whether he's from Candia or Negroponte. They're two different places. One is on Crete, one is in another island closer to the mainland. But we do know that he marries a woman, Pascuala Bernal. We know she's an Indian woman because their children were identified as mestizos. We don't know from where. I would think that we need to do research probably in the Mexico City records, but we need to look at the books of Costas, because they would not have been married in the cathedral, and their marriages would, and if they were, they were not in the book of Españoles. The folks in this early area kept different books: Españoles, baptisms and marriages and burials; Costas, burials, marriages, baptisms. So we need to search the Costas books to see if we can't find a marriage record for this couple somewhere, somehow. We have Hernando de Hinojos, another common ancestor, who marries into the Pérez de Bustillo family as well, from Andalusia. Now, there's this Pedro Lucero. He is not the same person as Pedro Lucero de Godoy. In fact, he's an older cousin of Pedro. Came to New Mexico and in 1598. And maybe I've got the date wrong on that one. It might have been 1600 for him. But he was a son of Juan Lucero, which means that Juan Lucero was a brother of Pedro's mother, Pedro Lucero de Godoy's mother. We don't know that he left any descendants in New Mexico, but he was still living here as late as the 1620s in New Mexico. Jerónimo Márquez, boy, this guy was a loyal supporter of Oñate from beginning to end, and he stayed. Even though he was at one point banished from New Mexico, he managed to return and left the Márquez surname in New Mexico. And through one of his daughters is an ancestor through the Madrid family. And so more research needs to be done here with these records from Sanlúcar de Mayor. We have not gone beyond the name of his father at this point. However, there's been this misinformation that his wife was Doña Ana de Mendoza y Saldiva, and it was not. So there's this misinformation here. That Doña Ana was the wife of someone else. But what we do know is that there is a record that he came to New Mexico with some relatives. These three men were referred to as all being brothers-in-law. Francisco Márquez, who may have been a brother of Jerónimo, and then Juan Díaz and Pedro Hernández, who may have been brothers-in-law of these two men. So we need to do some genealogical research looking into who is this Juan Díaz, who is this Pedro Hernández, who is this other Francisco Márquez. And you should know that Jerónimo named one of his sons Francisco. So clearly a family relationship there. We know he came with a wife, but we don't know her name. And we suspect that her surname may have been de la Vega, because that was the name that his daughter used when she married into the Madrid family. Another common ancestor, Alonso Martín Barba. He is a native of Sombrerete, Nueva Vizcaya, one of the few men here then from the New World. But we don't have much on his ancestry. We know that he had two wives, but early on he'd married a woman named Maria Martín. He married a second wife many years later, and she lived all the way into the 1680s. And here, this guy is probably one of the most common of common ancestors, because his progeny and his grandchildren, etc., were just numerous throughout New Mexico, the Martín Serrano family. Now, there's no evidence that his wife, Juana Rodriguez, actually arrived in New Mexico. So we don't know what children he may have had by her, but we know that he had a son, Hernan, by an Indian woman named Doña Inés. So hopefully many of you have read or heard about her, a Tano Indian, who came as an interpreter in the Oñate expedition. So she should get some credit for being someone who remained in New Mexico. And then Hernan had these two other sons, Luis Martín Serrano, who was in New Mexico. But there's a record that Hernan Martín had another son named Pedro Hernández. And this guy, Pedro Hernández, shows up in Guadalajara asking for some privileges to possess, I believe it's certain guns that he wanted permission to own or have. And he had mentioned that his father was Hernan Martín Serrano, who'd gone to New Mexico. But more research needs to be done. Please, there is some misinformation that links this Hernan Martin to somehow to a Martin and the Cortez. It's not accurate. It's not. We still just don't know where his father was from. We need to research the Zacatecas records. We haven't gotten beyond the genealogy of that father. There's an Indian named Juan Francisco, came as a soldier, but he was an aide to Don Juan de Escaramad. He stays in New Mexico, but we don't know much about him. Do think that this man named Juan de Pedraza was probably someone who stayed or at least had children and then died. But we have no record that he remained, but we have this Pedraza surname that shows up in the 1620s and 30s. And these women are said to be cousins of the Archuleta Perez de Bustillo children. So it's almost a fact then that these women's mothers were of that clan, the Perez de Bustillo Archuleta clan. And so we do suspect that he did remain in New Mexico, but we don't know much about his background or his genealogy. And here's one of the more other common families of this time period. Juan Perez de Bustillo, born in 1558 in Mexico City, son of Simon Perez. Now this is really early, folks. This is really something. I wish we could find more information on this Simon Perez guy if he was living in Mexico City in 1558. Just wondering, when he actually arrived in New Spain. Could he be a son or himself a conquistador? I don't know. But he marries a woman named Maria de la Cruz, either an Indian woman or a mestiza. Some of his kids are referred to as mestizos, but it could be that he was a mestizo and she was a mestiza. But the DNA for Maria de la Cruz, thanks to some of the research done through some of the DNA work here through the Society and others, and an article written by Henrietta Martinez Christmas has shown that her DNA is indeed Native American. But you can see here, we know that this couple came with 2 sons and 7 daughters. But as you can see here, we can only identify 4 daughters. And there are several others, I should say 3 others that are not known, that could have married into the Pedraza family or the Vasquez family or some others. But these are some of the founding mothers of New Mexico. We have Ana marrying the Archuleta. We have Beatriz marrying the Hinojos. We have Yumar marrying Antonio Baca. And we have Catalina marrying Alonso Varela. So some very common ancestors for us here. We have Francisco Ramirez Hachero, born in 1573, the son of Gomez de Salazar. Now, I don't find records for him, but we know that the surname Salazar, Ramirez de Salazar, and Salazar Hachero show up in New Mexico records in the middle 1600s. There's a man named Juan Ramirez de Salazar, who's a relative of Alonso Baca, Pedro Duran Chavez, and Fernando Duran Chavez. And so suspecting that maybe Francisco left and he came back, or he left and his son came back, but somehow the Salazar Hachero and Salazar Ramirez de Salazar families have this connection to this man. The surnames are just too much of a coincidence to think otherwise. So I suspect this guy did leave descendants in New Mexico. And of course, another famous name, many of you are descendants of Bartolome Romero from Corral de Almaguer. He's a son of Bartolome Romero and Maria de Deva. Thank you to Gloria Trujillo, who found this baptismal record for Bartolome in the early records. And then also to the research that Stan Hordes and Robert D. Martinez and Richard Salazar did in Spain to uncover a little bit more information about the Romero family in Spain. So we do have another generation on this family, but more research needs to be done. We still need to continue to do some research to understand the origins of the Deva family and to better understand the origins of the Romero family. And there is a group of people who are doing some of this research right now, going through the Inquisition records of Toledo, going through the archival records of Corral de Almaguer, looking at the archival records through Paras. We're trying to find more information on this origins of this man. There is a record of passage for him, so we know when he came to the New World. That's in the Paras online digital repository as well. So we filled in a little bit more information about this family, but there's more to be done. He marries Doña Lucia Lopez Robledo, the daughter of a couple, Pedro Robledo and Catalina Lopez, that did come in 1598. Unfortunately, Pedro dies on the way up here, but Catalina remains for a few years. But then eventually she leaves New Mexico. And one of her sons was living in Nueva Vizcaya in 1604. She returns to the community of Zamora, where the Robledos were living before they came to New Mexico. And 2 daughters remain, Lucia and another one that you'll see in just a moment here. The Robledo family, we've been able to do some more research on them as well. Got their record of passage. We have some relatives of theirs. And again, more research is needed, but there's a group that's actively looking to find more records related to Pedro. Then there's these guys. I don't know if anyone has taken any time at all to research any of the records from Compostela, but we have these two men with some rather unique names. If these guys had been surnamed Sanchez, good luck. We would have had all kinds of challenges. But Varela is pretty unique. And I don't know anyone who's actually dug into the records of Compostela for this time period. And I apologize, Pedro was born in 1574, not 1674. But we know the name of Alonso's wife, and they are common ancestors. We don't know the name of Pedro's wife, but we know these families from their distinctive surname of Varela Jaramillo, Varela de Losada. Now that Losada surname and Jaramillo should be a clue as to some genealogy. Apparently, Alonso and Pedro may have had a mother or a father named Losada or Jaramillo. We don't know what side of the family they took the Varela from. But these surnames, Varela, Jaramillo, Losada, should all be clues that we should be looking at those surnames in the records of Santiago de Compostela. So that's the 17 there. Two more, Juan de Vitoria. He's a son of Alonso Ruiz de Guzman. He's different than the next guy, Juan de Vitoria Carvajal, but probably a relative. But we don't know that he had, this first guy, we don't know if he had any wives or children in New Mexico, but he was still living in New Mexico in 1617. But Juan de Vitoria Carvajal, many people know about him because people have suspected he was somehow related to Luis de Carvajal, who was arrested, charged with practicing Judaism. However, this Juan de Vitoria Carvajal was born in Yatepec, which is to the southeast of Mexico City, a son of Juan de Carvajal. He had a wife whose name is not known, and he had two grown sons that came with him and a daughter. And it surprises me that we haven't spent enough time looking to find the name of that wife or to find a marriage record and to find more information on these two sons. Now, I have recently published in the New Mexico Genealogist a history of the Vitoria Carvajal that offers a few leads on this family. And I do think I have found his parents, but we need more records to confirm whether the Juan de Carvajal and Antonia de Vitoria were indeed his parents. But it's this woman, Madalena, who ends up having remained in New Mexico, and I'll show you more about her in a minute. Juan de Vitoria had a second marriage with Doña Isabel Holguin, and she was a daughter of a couple who came in 1600. And we know that this couple had children, Juan and Isabel. Then we have the families, 10 of them that came in 1608 or 1600 that remain. Famously, Cristobal Vaca, many of you are descendants of Cristobal, and his wife, Doña Ana Ortiz, native of Mexico City, a daughter of Francisco Pacheco. Just a few things about this. There was a red herring with this for many years, and it's still on the internet, where people had said that Francisco Pacheco was the same person as Francisco Pacheco de Córdoba Bocanegra, and that this family was related to Cortez and related to others, Vasquez de Coronado, etc. It's not accurate. We don't know who this Francisco Pacheco was. We don't know who his wife was. We don't know his genealogy. But we do have a couple of clues. We know from some research that I did recently and published that Cristobal was a maestro pasamanero, which means he did the gold trimmings on clothing and cloth, and it was very elaborate gold embroidery. If you ever look at these, particularly the folks who had wealth and their clothing, they would have these gold trims and elaborate gold embroidery, and that was his profession in Mexico City. But we know that when he got married, a man named Diego Pacheco, who resided in Pueblo de los Angeles, provided a 300 peso dowry, which is average. 300 pesos, they're from good families. These are folks that could actually afford a dowry. So I suspect that this Diego Pacheco is a relative of Doña Ana Ortiz. Could be a brother, could be an uncle, probably not a cousin, but it could be Francisco's brother or it could be Ana's brother. Keep in mind that there's a good chance that Francisco's wife was surnamed Ortiz. So we're looking for a combination of Francisco Pacheco married to an Ortiz, somewhere in that realm. But it'd be nice to see. I've tried to search for this Diego Pacheco, but I've not been successful. But I certainly welcome anyone here who wants to do some digging in the Puebla records, see if we can't find any people named Diego Pacheco, and we can perhaps narrow this down if any of them was the son of Francisco. But here's the better clue. We really got off track when people thought that this family was somehow connected to, the Bocanegra family and the Cortez family. We really got way off track. We got to get back to basics, folks. There's a reason why the children all have different surnames. The Bohorques, Zamora, Villanueva surnames are a genealogical clue that tells us that somehow these people were named after someone in the family. These women, Isabel and Juana, were likely named after a maternal or grandparent or great-grandparent. There is a baptismal record for a child who was the daughter of Juan Zamora and Juan Baca and Juana de Zamora. Could be a clue that Cristobal's father, Juan Baca, was married to Juana de Zamora. Could be a clue, but we'll have to do more research to find that out. But we need to go in a different direction with this family. We need to look up Bohorques, we need to look up Villanueva, we need to look up Zamora, and find Bacas who are connected to these families and put that genealogy together. Then we have this interesting guy. He really an understated individual that deserves a little more attention in our history. He's a common ancestor, Alvaro Garcia Holgado. He's a mulatto, part Indian, part African. Later marries this woman, Juana de los Reyes, also mulata, sister of a woman named Juana Sanchez. And he was still living in the 1640s, and he was serving on the town council of Santa Fe. We don't know a lot about his history, but we need to piece it together a little bit more because he clearly stuck it out for quite a long while in New Mexico, coming in 1600 and then still living in 1640. And then this couple, Juan Lopez Villasaña, also known as Juan Lopez Holguín, from Fuente Vajuna. We got a little more information on her family. We know a little bit more about her parents, Juan Lopez and Doña Ana Florencia. Notice that name, Ana. Notice the surname Villanueva. And notice that the two children are named Maria Ortiz and Ana Ortiz. I do think that Catalina Villanueva and Ana Ortiz of the Baca family were somehow related. They were either stepsisters, they were either half sisters, or they were perhaps cousins, but there's a relationship. And we know that Juan Lopez was a maestro de arte de las sedas, satin silk. He could put silk together. He was a member of a guild, so there must be some guild records on him. We know that he rented a shop and a house on Calle de la Salada, and that his wife was an orphan in the prestigious Colegio de las Doncellas, only 15 girls, and her dowry brought 500 pesos. 500 was the top, folks. The elite of the elite, 500 pesos. She came from a really good family, but we don't know who that family is yet. And then we have this man named Juan Luis. He marries a Maria Lujan, becomes the progenitor of the Luis Lujan family that eventually becomes Lujan. We know he's born in New Mexico in 1606, 1609. We just don't know his parents, but he's a common ancestor for many of us. And then, of course, there's Juan Lujan, who came from the Canary Islands. Although we don't know the name of his wife, we know that there were these three siblings that were mestizos, and we suspect that these are his children, but we just don't have a record to confirm it. But look how early they were born, and we suspect that he is indeed their father. And then we have Bartolome Montoya, another one that we need to dig into the records of Santillana to find more about the Montoya. We do not have a record of passage from him yet, but we know that his wife was an Indian woman. She was from a particular barrio in Mexico City that was an old neighborhood of the Mexica. We know the name of her father and mother, and we know that they had a son that was baptized on the route north, but more research needs to be done to understand these family genealogies. And you can see here just some of the kids that were born. And in one of these records, that baptismal record, she has a surname Cepeda. Whether that was actually her other surname or whether the priest misheard Zamora for Cepeda, we don't know. But that José de Montoya was born in Guanajuato, and that's where that record is. And then we have Juan Rodriguez Bellido of Guibero León. He's the son of Francisco Núñez. And then this man named Pedro, but we don't know that either one of these left any descendants in New Mexico. And then we have Juan Ruiz de Cázares, his son of Pedro. His wife may have been Isabel, but we don't know. But we know he had a daughter who married into the Madrid family. And then Blas de Valencia. We don't know the name of his wife or even whether he actually stayed in New Mexico, but this boy named Francisco de Valencia is born around 1610, 11, we believe to be the son of Blas. And then the last ones here, the last 4 or 5 here, we have Pedro Durán Chavez, shows up in New Mexico by 1610, 1609, marries into the Baca family. We have Francisco Gomez, recruited in Spain by Alonso de Oñate, the brother of Juan, son of Manuel Gomez, Ana Vicente, marries into the Robledo family, and then becomes the founder of the Gomez Robledo family. Curiously, in terms of his genealogy, he has several relatives that were members of the Inquisition in Portugal, which means that these men, in order to get to their positions, had to submit some sort of proof of lineage. They had to submit their genealogy. So we need to research the Inquisition records of Portugal to see if we can't find records in which they gave the names of their immediate ancestors. More research to be done there. Domingo Gonzalez, his birthplace, we don't know. He born in 1572. We know he comes to New Mexico around 1605-07. He marries Magdalena de Carvajal, a daughter of Juan de Vitoria, and his first wife. He's not a brother Sebastian. He's not a son of Diego. That's misread there in the records. But he does have descendants through either a daughter or a granddaughter named Antonia Gonzalez de Vitoria, who's the mother of the Maestas family. So those of you that are Mestas or Maestas, these would be your ancestors. Then there's his other Portuguese, Sebastian Gonzalez, marries into the Riego Bernal family, came to New Mexico as a child. We don't know who his parents were, but he was only one of 2 Portuguese living in New Mexico in 1640, not a son of Diego Blandin. And then we know that this Juan Lopez Mederos probably had 2 children carrying that surname in New Mexico. And then this common ancestor, Francisco Lopez Paredes, from Jerez de la Frontera, marries an Indian woman, and we are descendants of his through Francisco Anaya and Juana Lopez. And then, of course, there's the Madrids, came in 1603 to New Mexico and married into the Martin Barba and the Marquez family. And last but not least, presumably this Juan de Tapia, very little is known about him, but the Tapia name did survive in New Mexico, and he married into the Robledo family. So let me finish up here, and we'll open it up to some questions, Henrietta. I want to emphasize something here, that there were Indian women who were founders of Spanish New Mexico. When you think Spanish, don't think race, think culture. And there were these women who were acculturated, who took the Spanish culture, even though their background and ancestry is Native American, that came and stayed in New Mexico. And these are some of those women who are common ancestors. But this also tells us we have very, very deep roots in central Mexico. Native American indigenous roots in New Mexico, in Mexico today. But let's honor the fact that when we say Spanish, we're not just talking a race, we're talking a culture that had Indian influences. When you look at the geographic origins of these folks, the majority came from Andalusia, but only 18 out of these 37 folks came from the Iberian Peninsula. There were about 24 females in this region, but this is our origin story, folks, not 1598. This is our origin here. And when you look at the numbers over the next several decades, you got 48 soldiers in 1617, it doesn't grow much. 20 soldiers in 1670, still doesn't grow much. 1626, 50 soldiers, about 250 individuals, about 1,000 mestizos. 1638, still 50 soldiers. Folks, there are more than 50 people in this room. So we already outnumber the number of soldiers that lived in New Mexico in the first 4 decades already. They were not a large group. And you know what? They did not get along. These 50 people or so broke up into 2 different camps pretty quickly in 1610, 12, 13, 14. Some of them became supporters of the Franciscan friars as the main authority of governance in New Mexico. And you'll see here the majority of these folks, the ones in yellow are the ones that came during the Oñate period. And the ones that are underlined were people who over time were arrested by the governors for some charge. Those who have asterisks were actually executed as traitors to the crown, but they were fierce supporters of the Franciscan authority in New Mexico, fierce supporters. The other part, del parte de rey, were the supporters of the governors. And you'll recognize some of these families here. And again, those that are underlined are people who were denounced to the Inquisition by the Franciscans. The Franciscans used the Inquisition against their enemies. You'll notice that none of the people in the other ones were denounced to the Inquisition, but they were arrested by the governors. And then these guys here, you'll see we're loyal to the governors. The ones in yellow again are from the early Oñate period. If you want to learn more, the fabulous book here, The Spanish Colonial Settlement Landscape of New Mexico, has a lot of details. I was very privileged to work with Eleanor Barrett on this book and provide her some of my research. She has great tables in the back that give you names of people who stayed, names of people who came, a sense of where people lived in New Mexico. And then we have this book, The Last Conquistador, as well. What I really want to emphasize is the fact that in these early years, although we have these smaller families that join forces, it created this period of strife from 1610 to 1640 that resulted in the death of a governor. And the people who were supporters of the Franciscan friars tended to intermarry with each other. And the people who were supporters of the governors tended to intermarry with each other. And occasionally they would cross boundaries, but not always. So they did not all get along, but they are our ancestors. So I'm going to stop sharing right there, and let's go to some questions. Henrietta, do we have a few questions from people? And if you didn't see a name of an ancestor you think should be on that list, let me know, because I am not opposed to adding folks to that list. And my plan is to post that list on the Beyond Origins of New Mexico Families website before the end of the year. So you will see that list posted as well. So
All right, I hope everyone can hear me.
There you are. You're there now. I can hear you.
Trying to get myself organized here. And José, thank you again so much for this compilation of, you know, vast amounts of history and genealogical research all at the same time. As I think Damien said in his opening comments, that people make the history. And so, you know, it becomes valuable to us at that point. Can you guys hear me or not? Or
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
I can't hear myself. So
yeah.
Anyway, let's go to some of the questions.
Mhm.
So Angela Lewis wants to know when your book's going to be ready for sale.
on the on 17th, it's going to be a while, folks. You're going to get retired first here in about a year and a half. But I can tell you this is that a lot of it's written already, and you can read parts of it because some of the material that I've published in El Farolito and in the Mexico Genealogist will be part of that. So some of the book will be history on just general history of New Mexico. Some will be the history of the families. So if you've read my histories of the Romero family, of the Martin Serrano, of the Madrids, of the Lopez Holguin and the Carvajal, some of the Chavez work, some of this material will show up in the book as well. But give me time. It's going to take a while. So still probably about 3-4 years down the road. Got another question? Let's see. Now's your chance, folks. Type them in and we'll pull
So
them
should
out.
we go on to the second question?
Yeah.
All righty. So this one's a little bit longer. So it says Francisco Ramirez de Salazar was also from Cartaya.
Yeah.
I believe Achero with an H was a nickname. Was this based on a weapon in the military, such as Axeman and a medieval weapon?
It's a good
Chavez
question.
has him arriving in New Mexico in early 1600s. Did he come back?
Yeah, that's what we need a little more research on. And it's possible that Hachero, does refer back to something. Who knows? Someone in that family may have had a tool like that and they adopted that surname. It's very possible that occurred. We do know that Hachero
Okay,
surname.
the next question.
Oh, wait, hang on, Henrietta. Oh, are you okay there? We do know that the Hachero surname shows up.
Colonists escaping the Inquisition.
Oh, okay, hang on a minute. On that first one, the Hacheros, we know that the Hachero surname shows up in the 1680s, so we know it's used as a surname. It shows up in the 1640s as well, connected to the Salazar name as also. So it gets used intermittently, but we do need to do a little more research on that just to see what origin does that particular name have. We don't know. Francisco may have left and then his son may have come back, but more research needs to be done on that.
Okay.
On the Inquisition.
There was another question to the Francisco Achero Salazar was beheaded for his involvement in the Rosas affairs.
Yes, Francisco de Salazar and then Juan Ramirez de Salazar were both executed.
Okay.
Again, these were guys who were fierce supporters of the Franciscans. And it was these supporters that got themselves in trouble by following through on a plot to kill the governor.
All
And
righty.
so what's the question on the Inquisition?
Just were colonists escaping the Inquisition?
No, they didn't come here to escape the Inquisition. As you can tell, some of the 18 or 19 of the folks that were, stayed from the Oñate period, they were coming up here to look for gold and silver. And then when they decided to remain, we still don't know quite sure why these guys stayed. But no, you couldn't escape the Inquisition because the Inquisition was in New Mexico. In fact, one of the first cases is from 1607. So no, they weren't coming to escape the Inquisition. The Inquisition was here. And it was formally established a little bit later in the 1620s as a formal, having a representative, but already denunciations were occurring in 1607.
Okay.
But no, and if you take a look at the Inquisition records, let me go, there was a slide there. The only people who ever went to trial who were accused and denounced were supporters of the governors. So, they weren't up here looking for Jews. They weren't, in fact, quite frankly, one of the hardest things to think about is that when you have these clans, 50 men divided into two groups of political adversaries at each other's throats, burning each other's property, willing to fight each other for supremacy of what they believe in, I think it'd be really kind of hard, to be thinking about, am I trying to hide something? I don't know which camp the secret Jews would have been in, which camp were you going to be in to survive? They did not get along, folks. One thing to keep in mind, that not all our families got along. They feuded really badly during this time period. They did not like each other.
Thank you. So the next question is, what was the document with the signatures of the men that stayed, and where is it available?
It can be found on, I do believe it's online now. I think it can be found on the Cibola website. It's a letter that was written. I'd have to get the right title for you all, but I do believe it's on the Cibola Project website now. I extracted it from a microfilm that was in the New Mexico Records and Archives many years ago, back in the 90s. But I do believe that is now available online, 1604. I have to get you the citation on that.
Okay.
But,
all right. Thank you. Okay. So with regard to the two separate factions that allied with the governors versus the Franciscans, what do you believe were the motivations? Were those families more closely related with similar origins?
No, actually, that's what's interesting about it. If you look at the diversity, folks, there's no similarity. I mean, we're not looking at a group of people who traveled together and came and settled here. You can see they're all from these different places, very diverse. I think it does come down to two things. One, I know that in history books, it's often referred to as the state, the church versus the state conflict. That's not accurate. The church was the state. It was the kings who oversaw the church in their realms, the kings of Spain, the monarchs, the emperors, oversaw the church in their realms. And so it really was this fierce sense of faith. Do you support the faith, or are you a little more secular? And so really that conflict comes from, am I going to support the secular government and the governor, or am I going to be fiercely supportive of my religious faith and my belief that the Franciscans and God are the supreme authority, and that's who I'm going to follow and support. So it really comes down to, I think, convictions, religious convictions, perhaps their upbringing in terms of those convictions. Doesn't mean that the people who supported governors were not religious people. They still had their faith and still practiced the Catholic faith, but politically, they may have found themselves on the extremes.
Okay, thank you. All righty, from Maria Lobato. José, we appreciate the work you have done on several generations of the Martin family. Martinez, have you published other families of definitive genealogy so we can clean up our family trees?
Yes, I have. And maybe I just need to get that posted. I know if you look on the Beyond Origins of New Mexico website, you'll find my bibliography, but I have published on the lengthy history and revised genealogy of the Madrids, lengthy history, revised genealogy of the Lopez de Holguin family, which includes the Carvajal family, a lengthy genealogy of history. Actually, you've seen the genealogy of the Martin Sonano, but I got a history of them published as well. And then the Romero family, three-part history on the Romero family, and then numerous others. So take a look at my bibliography on the origins of NM families, and you'll find my whole list of almost 200 some articles on those families. And many
Okay.
of the ones will eventually form part of this book as well.
All right. So what happened to Oñate after he left New Mexico?
Okay, several things. So he gets to Mexico City. Then he probably went back to part of his land in Zacatecas, but he was put on trial. There was an investigation that continued from 1608, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and he was finally convicted of several crimes. And at that point, he was banished from ever coming to New Mexico. Although he remained in the New Spain for a while, he eventually went to Spain itself. He eventually went to the Iberian Peninsula, where he worked as an official overseeing activities related to some mining. That was his experience, was mining. He fought really hard to undo the stain on his name and to gain his reputation back, which he did somewhat succeed in that. He managed to get himself inducted into the Order of Santiago. So he went back and at least got himself made a caballero. And he eventually dies in a cave-in in Spain in the early 1620s. And his son stayed in Spain, and there are descendants of his son still living in Spain today.
Cool. All righty. Okay, Jose, I had thought there was an Antonio Mejia, but didn't see him mentioned in your presentation. Did Antonio Mejia not stay in New Mexico? My husband has a Mejia line and I'm stuck. This is from Mariana Ortiz.
Yeah, no Mejia stayed in New Mexico. So I'd have to double check the list to see which muster roll this person appears in, but no, Mejia did not stay in New Mexico. They left.
The next question might be something that you could refer a book to this question. Who were the Franciscans present from 1609 to 1640?
Good question. There may be some references in the different books. I have a list on my computer. I've been keeping track of who these guys are for a couple of reasons. But I haven't really seen, I think that if you were to look at the indexes of the New Mexico Historical Review, you might find a few authors who wrote about some of these folks. You might find some references in Scholes' book. Franz Scholes, if you do a search of Franz Scholes, he did a series of articles in the New Mexico Historical Review on the Franciscan missionary. And Franz Scholes might be one of your best searches, I think, to find those articles in the New Mexico Historical Review on them. Now, one of the reasons to keep track of these guys is one thing I should do a presentation on is there's another set of founding fathers, and I'm talking Franciscan fathers. The
holy ones.
Exactly. We don't have them very well documented, but I can almost tell you that there's probably a good number of individuals among the Pueblo Indians and among the Spanish population who are descendants of these priests, but we don't know quite who they are. We have some hints here and there, but I have been keeping track in the Inquisition records. Every so often, someone says, oh, by the way, this man was the father and so and so. And there's this really good record that says, from the supporters of the governors criticizing the Franciscans, saying these Franciscans, they give dowries for their daughters, they give land for their sons. Now, we don't know who they are, but clearly there are people on the side of that supported the Franciscans that were the sons and daughters that were being granted lands and dowries.
Okay, we have another question, but I think this is more of the book that will be coming out. Where will the citations to these documents be posted, or etc.?
So for right now, what you can do is that all the information that I presented in history can be found in the book by Hammond and Ray, Don Juan de Oñate, Colonizer of New Mexico. Although that book is hard to get, they did publish a series of this before it was a book in the New Mexico Historical Review. So if you just research or search George Hammond, Don Juan de Oñate, you can find the different series that you can start looking at. But I would say go to the Cibola Project and just type in Oñate, and you can find the transcriptions to these records as well. They're all in Spanish, so you'll have to know Spanish. But that's where that is. In terms of the individuals, I'll provide those citations when I post this on the New Mexico Beyond Origins of New Mexico website. I'll put the citations that says this is how we know, that these people stayed in New Mexico. So that'll show up online.
I skipped a question. So which of these families has the most descendants? Would it be Juan Perez de Bustillo and Maria de la Cruz, since they had 7 daughters?
Most likely. I would say there's two going head to head here. It's the Perez de Bustillos, but also the Martin Serrano. So I would say they're in good competition with each other. Partly because in the Martin Serrano, if you've seen the genealogy that's been posted, these grandsons of Hernan had 2 or 3 wives. They had 20 children each, huge clan. So, that one I still think has probably got maybe the Pettis of Bastille partly beat, but those would be the 2 top clans, I would say.
Okay, of the 50 who stayed, how many were mestizos?
Good question, because the women were Indian. So I think we can more clearly say we had Indian wives, and so their children would have been mestizos. Of the men themselves who came, as you saw in the numbers I put up there, 18 of them or so were from Spain. So we know that they're not mestizos. We know that Alvaro Garcia Holgado was part Indian, part African. But I would say most of them were not as much mestizo, but their children were.
Okay. And then we still have time. So Yvette Storr would like to know, she says, this is a subjective question, would like to know your feelings about recognizing Genízaro culture and parallel the existence of crypto and Sephardic Jews in New Mexico.
So for Genízaro, definitely. And this is a group that gains more attention in the 1700s than in the 1600s. And keep in mind that there's a second beginning of New Mexico cultural history, which I really think is the main beginning of this in the 1690s. Not only do you have these descendants of these original colonists from 1609 that return in 1692, 93, but you have these people from Mexico City, we have people from Zacatecas, all blending in the 1690s to create a new culture. But in that culture, one of the things you start to see happening in the early 1700s is people are taking in these children. They're rescuing either women or children from Indian tribes that have captured Indian and children and sold them across the indigenous tribes, the nomadic tribes. And these Spaniards bring them into their household to raise them in the Catholic faith and the Spanish culture. They are servants. They're often identified as servants, and they provide help. But then as adults, they are then free to marry and live. And so, yes, that Genízaro culture that starts to develop in the 1700s is an influential factor into the development of Nuevo Mexicano culture. And it's something that I've written about in an article and another presentation called The Formative Era of New Mexico History, of New Mexico culture. But it is something to be recognized, but it's better studied in the 1700s than it is in the 1600s. In terms of conversos, keep this in mind that any number of those 37 men and their wives that weren't Indian could have had Jewish ancestry. We have not yet traced any one of these families back to a definitive Jewish converso family. To do that, we have to trace those families back probably to the 1400s. We're only into the mid 1500s. So we still have 2 or 3 more generations to go. There are hints from records in the 1700s, but keep in mind that those hints come from this strife. They come from people who were really fighting with each other and the Franciscans denouncing people. I'm surprised there weren't more denouncements of people being Jews, because what a good way to get somebody in trouble with the Inquisition is to say they're practicing Judaism. But they didn't do that except for one man and the governor and his wife, Lopez de Mendizábal. But we are going to find this. We just have to keep researching to find where those families were from in the 14 or 1300s. So we just got to keep digging.
So I have a question. There's so many questions in the chat too. I'm kind of going back and forth, but my question to you is, we have Origins of New Mexico Families, and we kind of consider that our Bible, right? I mean, I've owned several copies since I've been doing research because they fall apart.
Yeah.
How valid is it to still use that?
I would still use it, folks. It's a good starting point. I would make sure you have a copy of it. I always refer to it constantly. And this was one of the reasons that I created, myself and John B. Culligan, began thinking through a way to share information, because we were seeing that people were going to kind of go over the same ground over and over again, and came up with this idea of the Beyond Origins. It was originally a bit of an article in the Herencia Journal of the New Mexico Genealogical Research Center of New Mexico, but we took that name, Beyond Origins, and created a website. So be sure to do 2 things: get a copy of Origins of New Mexico Families, and then bookmark Beyond Origins. Because in the Beyond Origins, I am creating corrections. I am posting those corrections. We're posting new information. In the early years, I took information, I allowed people to submit information. So I was getting research from a lot of people. You'll see everyone gets credit who did some research gets credit. Lately, it's been mostly my work, or if I see something published in a journal, I'll add it to that website. But use both of those as a starting ground, must-haves.
Okay, and then Damien here, Damien Aragon has, as president of NMGS, got this great idea that we would start purchasing more books with the intent of doing this top-down, bottom-up research and sort of meeting in the middle. And I don't know, Damien, you're on if you want to talk a little bit about that, and maybe Jose, I know, has been helping direct us to some books to purchase, so on and so forth.
Yeah, there's been a number of books that we've been trying to purchase. One of them is a series. I think it's by the magazine is, I think it's called Hidalga, but also I think it's a series of books about during the different reigns of the different kings, and it has to do with litigation over their nobility for different reasons. And in each of those, they generally mention, that the person that's providing the court case or whatever, and then they're asked to submit their documentation for their nobility for different reasons. And so the library should have a different set of series on those, at least 6 or 7 for Queen Juana, several of the Phillips, Charles. So these records are out there, and you're right. It's sort of coming both ways, what we know to what these early ancestors are on the other side. Is one series of books that we've done, and we've also picked up some from Mexico, and records that we can secondary sources, of course, but records that we can use.
Great.
Yes, that's one. And then I have a couple comments, and one of them is Debbie Gertler from FamilySearch.org. I'm going to give her that title right here now. I call her the queen of family history library. She posted in the chat that's off to the side the link for I'm going to call it the Tombo for Portugal. It's the archive for Portugal, and guys can go in and scroll up and down and find it. But she says that they are available, the Inquisition documents for Portugal. She's actually a Portuguese, I would call, say, expert. So she, dives into those records all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's important to get into those records, because giving those names that I showed you on the Gomez side, in order to be these top officials, I mean, one guy was like a judge. He would sit on the cases that were the most challenging cases. He was well educated, but in order to attain a high position in the Inquisition, you had to have a proof of lineage. So, or if not that, his name he's going to have a name and signature. He's going to have signed off on a bunch of records as a consultor, or even a commissary. A commissary had to actually go out and collect the information from witnesses. So these guys would be in the records somewhere. A familiar was someone who lived in a community and reported on people. So these guys are going to be in the records somewhere. We just have to dig into those records. And keep in mind that Pedro Robledo, he was a familiar of the Inquisition as well. So he's going to have a proof of lineage in the Toledo Inquisition, potentially, if it survived in time. And that would give us the names of his parents and his grandparents, possibly his great-grand.
Yeah, possibly. Okay, something else, that another question, place to find origins that's affordable. That's a real tough one, because sometimes they quit publishing it and it's not $50 anymore. It's on the used book market. But Debbie posted us, again, Debbie Gertler, thank you. She posted in the chat, sites.google.com, beyond origins, families for your information. And then I think kind of what I've done is, you just find the book, copy the pages that you need. It's kind of how I started way back in the day. Got to buy a book.
Well, I know we have about a minute left, so let me just conclude and say, look, once I get this list published, folks, no need to dig through. This is, again, we've done some of the hard work for everybody. We've sifted through all those muster rolls. We've gone through the records to find out who actually stayed. I know there's hundreds of names in there, but 1609, that list of 37 will give you a good sense of the start of where to focus our genealogical research and where to begin taking a look at where we need to go in Spain, or I would say Mexico City or Puebla with the Pacheco family, for us to start looking for more records. And then certainly, you know, I continue to look at records related to New Mexico 17th century to find more people who I might be able to say, oh, this is a person who came in that early period as well. But that list of 37 is pretty accurate, and I would love to add more names if we can find them, or find more records to confirm that information as well. But I want to thank you all very much, and let's see if we can all start thinking about 1609 as the new start for our genealogical and cultural history in New Mexico. Credit goes to Oñate for what he did in starting some things, but it did not survive past him as much as these other people need credit for having stuck it out and established New Mexico, even though they fought each other.
All righty. Well, Jose, thank you so much. And this will conclude our first lecture of the day, titled, "And Then There Were 50, the Spanish Settlers That Remained in New Mexico After 1609. We will take a break until 11:30, and we will see you then. Thank you again. Muchas gracias.